It's such a great privilege to present our special guest today, who brings incredible journey of being pastor, teacher, spiritual educator, psychotherapist, who lived across different countries, continents, and experiences, and who recently published his book Step Beyond Suffering, which talks about transcending our suffering, seeing our ego in a true light, and finding our joy in living this adventure. And we will be having an incredible discussion today. So I'd like to introduce our guest, Peter Weber, and invite you to join our discussion today. And before we deep dive into the book, I'd like to ask you about a little bit about your path. What have been key chapters in your roles that shaped who you are today, and what led you to the creation of this wonderful book that you wrote?
Well, thank you for that. I guess I would say that one of the benefits of being older is that you can look back on things and see how life develops. And as I look back, I see different areas of my life. For example, I was at one point a teacher, and at one point I studied psychotherapy. I've been a pastor in a church since my mid-20s and still am. But I'm also a person in recovery. That's to say, I'm an addict, an alcoholic to be precise, but I have been sober now for very many years. But that is an essential element in my makeup, along with the other elements. And what I found to be growing within me was the desire to pull these different strands of my life together, because I have learned different skills in different areas. And sometimes the skills match exactly, and sometimes the skills build on each other to create something new. And what this book does is to attempt to put these strands together and to build something new. So I've taken an idea from theology, Greek Orthodox theology, an idea which is to do with compulsive thinking. And this idea I have developed then across the other parts of my life, bringing in the pastoral aspects of what this means, the psychological and spiritual aspect of what this means, and simply attempted to share this accumulated experience with anybody that wants to read it and perhaps find some sort of help in facing their own life problems.
Thank you so much for a great introduction. You mentioned that you served as a teacher, as a pastor, as a psychotherapist, as a retreat leader, spiritual teacher. How did these different roles converge into the voice that created Step Beyond Suffering?
All those things are true about me. I don't claim to be a spiritual anything at all. That's up to other people to decide. I simply share information or share experience as I can. But then in another dimension, I am one person, in that I try to heal myself or be in a state of healing using the principles outlined in the book. In that way, I attempt to show the path to other people, should they choose to use it. Not, I see myself as a fellow traveler, able simply to share experience, strength, and hope with other people in order to help them the problems that they face in their everyday lives.
Thank you. From your perspective, having worked both in religious therapeutic spaces, how do you see the current landscape? Because today a lot of things are converged, and are people more lost or more ready than ever from your perspective?
In very general terms, I see the world, as it were, getting worse and worse, but that the individual people within the world have more and more choices to transform themselves. I think this is much truer now than it has ever been true, at least in my lifetime. There are a lot of positive things going, whilst the world itself looks as if it's going to hell in a handbasket. This does have the effect, though, of waking people up a little bit. Not, but in the process of waking up, we suddenly realize that we have choices that we can make. It doesn't matter what the world is doing, how badly the world is misbehaving. We can make choices for ourselves that can make our own lives a little bit better. And as we make our own lives a little bit better, so that improvement sort of overflows to people around. They may or may not know this. It may be completely hidden to most people. But if we are prepared to change the world, not by trying to change the world, because frankly, politics has been trying to do that since day one, and I don't see it working. What can work is that people actually work on themselves and change themselves. And therefore, society becomes something more agreeable, something more supportive, something more spiritual for everybody to take part in.
What was your own relationship with the ego? Like before you began this deeper work, did you have a defining moment when you realized how much power it had over your life?
I suppose that would have to be related to the worst days of my alcoholic drinking. Alcoholism is sometimes described as self-will run riot. Somewhat old-fashioned phrase, but it defines what the ego is capable of doing rather carefully. And what alcoholism was able to do to me was to take me to a place of complete numbness, to be disconnected from myself, disconnected from those around me, disconnected from God, from the universe, from the big picture, leaving me with a bottle, very often an empty bottle in front of me, and a great deal of sadness and shame, destructive thinking. But at a certain point, and I can't account for this in any straightforward way, I was able to throw off the need to be drinking alcohol constantly and to begin recovery. It took a long time. Although I had degrees and all sorts of things to help, unfortunately, I was a slow learner, and it took several years to come to grips with this particular issue. And once I came to grips with the issue, recovery started really slowly. Although I stopped drinking at one point and never to this day started again, the other parts of my life which needed to heal sometimes took a long time. And in that process, I've tried various things. As you say, I've been able to share in retreats, I've in a pastoral role, and as a therapist. And in each of those areas, my own recovery shines light on other people's problems. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm in any sense perfect. In fact, I'm not even working towards being perfect. I don't think that's a good aim to have. It would be nice to improve, but perfection is off the cards. It's simply not what I'm attempting to do at all. I simply want to improve a little in the way that I live, in the way I relate to the world, to other people, and to myself, in the various areas in which I encounter people. I notice that I've chosen over the years tasks, occupations, you might say, where I'm blessed with having intimate discussions with people as a pastor, as a teacher, and as a therapist. I think this has caused me to a great deal of information that most people simply don't have access to. So I've been able to meet people in their joy, but I've also been able to meet people in their pain and almost everywhere in between. And this depth of intimacy, I think, gives life to what I write in the book. I really hope that what I write resonates with people, not in an intellectual sense, because that's not what we're talking about. There's nothing to do with understanding suffering. You can do that if you want. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't achieve anything. Much more is to find out what suffering can actually offer you in terms of transformation. And it's the transformation that I'm most interested in, my own, but everybody else's as well.
Thank you. Your perspective, having worked both in religious and therapeutic spaces, how do you see the current landscape? Because today a lot of things are converged, and are people more lost or more ready than ever from your perspective?
Well, that is a very important question and not one that's particularly easy to answer. Let me start off by saying that I assume that everybody has inner voices. Sometimes they don't speak with words, which makes them very difficult to define as voices, but sometimes they do. And the classic example of what it means to have voices in your mind that doesn't necessarily mean you're going crazy is if you're lying awake in bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, too tired to get up, but not tired enough to fall asleep. In that situation, you more or less have to listen to the thoughts in your head. And if you choose to listen to those thoughts for any length of time and begin to analyze what they are all about, you'll find that they come in basically two flavors. The first flavor is very definitely fear. And many of those ideas, thoughts, patterns, whatever, will present themselves in this fashion. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I have cancer? What if I lose my job? What if the sky falls down? What if my child gets sick? What if I'm fired tomorrow? And so on. What if thoughts are very much at the center of giving us a great deal of pain that we can't avoid. What if thoughts take us from where we are and dump us into a place of pain and simply leave us there? They abandon us to the pain and say, you get on with it. There is another flavor of thoughts, and that is desire. And desire is almost always to do with what you don't have. In many people's idea, desire sounds sort of desirable. Let's want things because wanting gives us motivation and so on. I don't see it that way so much. What I see in the desire thoughts is that they always point out what you're missing. So I would like to have a better car, better spouse, better whatever, is another way of saying I lack the car I want. I lack the house I want. I lack the job I want, and so on. So there too, these thoughts bring us to a place of pain and simply drop us. And what I've done in the book is simply to identify this group of thoughts. All I've done in the book is to name this entire bunch of thinking, which most have experienced simply as an experience, as the ego. So what is the ego? The ego is the accumulated amount of impulsive, compulsive, uninvited thoughts that bombard us 24. In fact, listen to them in the middle of the night because you have no other choice. During the day, we have other choices. During the day, we can turn on the television or play with a computer or go into a video game or whatever it is to distract ourselves. And in fact, that's a lot of our behavior seems to be designed to help us avoid listening to these thoughts. I've worked in prison ministry for quite a long time, and in most prisons throughout the world, putting someone in a room by themselves with nothing to distract them is very often used as a form of punishment. Isolation cells are still very popular, and perhaps they need to be. I'm not the judge of that situation. But what I'm saying is, listening to your thoughts when you have no ability to distract yourself is a painful occupation. So taking that idea, calling it the ego, I then began to look at various forms of psychotherapy which would allow people to, at the very least, to ignore these thoughts so that they could concentrate on something other than pain. And then going back to spiritual issues, sometimes religious, sometimes not, I discovered that in spiritual talk, there is the notion of the soul. Unfortunately, this word, the soul, is so heavily burdened with various ideas which actually depend on whatever religious interests you might have. The word itself doesn't actually mean anything, although we use it as if we know exactly what it means. When Plato used the word, he used it in a very particular sense. When a 19th century American Protestant uses the word, it may mean something completely different. But from there, I deduce that there is a part of the self which is not the ego, which has, as it were, some eternal quality, some eternal significance. The ego is simply an accumulation of thoughts, bad thoughts, thoughts we could live without. But behind that, there is the self, possibly the soul, if you want to use that word. But I've used this in the book, I've used self with a capital S just to signify that it's something sort of special. And the self is the part of you that has eternal quality, the part of you that doesn't die with the body, the part of you that is somehow in connection with the big picture, with God, with the universe, with everybody else, and so on. The difficulty at the beginning is to tell the difference between the two voices. And we're not helped here by the fact that the ego, most of the time, tries to get our attention whenever we try to put our attention elsewhere and start shouting louder so that it can grab our attention. The ego thinks that it is keeping us safe by giving us these fearful or desire-filled thoughts. I maintain that that may have been true somewhere in our evolutionary past. For example, I can quite well imagine that several 100,000 years ago, when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, like so many other animals on the planet, vigilance that was required to be a hunter-gatherer meant that you had to be afraid almost all the time. If you watch a bird come into your garden like that, the little bird comes in, and the first thing it does is to look around very carefully. It does so very quickly, but it looks around to make sure there are no cats present or some other thing that could cause it harm. Our ancestors were trampling through jungles, the tundra, wherever it is they happen to be, trying to hunt food, for example, without themselves becoming food for some other animal on the way. They had to be vigilant all the time. In the modern world, we don't have to be vigilant. Not in that way. We have a great deal of security in our lives. Most of us don't need to worry about being attacked by tigers as we're walking along the pavement. Strangely, we do have to worry about being attacked by, say, cars or bikes. Here in the Netherlands, bikes are an issue. But we're very nonchalant about those, although they can cause us a great deal of pain. But our bodies are still attuned to the old thing, to the possibility that something is going to leap out at us and cause us grief. So the ego thinks it's defending us, when in fact all it's doing is causing us pain. But beneath the ego, there is the self, which simply quietly observes. And it's from the self that we get inspiration, the encouragement to get up in the morning and to do what we need to do to help other people, to help ourselves improve in the way we're alive. So that's a broad picture of what I'm trying to present in the book and make available to others. Now, a lot of this will not be new to everybody. Some of it may be. And perhaps, everybody speaks with a unique voice, and this happens to be mine. If it helps people, good.
Thank you, Peter. For those listeners who haven't read Step Beyond Suffering yet, how would you describe the heart of this book? What is it about, and what do you hope readers take away from it?
I guess the core answer to that question would be to show people that they actually have choices where they're not aware that they have choices, that the constant bombardment of negative thinking must be a sort of optional extra. One of the problems, though, is that we can't switch the thoughts off. There isn't a mechanism, at least not yet. Perhaps we will evolve such a mechanism as humanity evolves on a biological speed, which is actually quite slow in the years to come, but it won't happen in my lifetime for a start. But we do need to learn how to avoid letting these thoughts dominate our lives. And there are various ways of doing that, and the book attempts to show how to set about doing just that.
Thank you. Why the title Step Beyond Suffering? What does it mean to step beyond in your experience, Peter?
Suffering is not the enemy, at least suffering that's in someone's past, because suffering also is one of our best teachers. It gets our attention. It's very difficult to ignore. So when we're suffering, we are usually in a position to be able to find a pathway of transformation. If we're not suffering, frankly, it might take 1,000,000 lifetimes. But if we're suffering, and most of us are in one way or another, particularly because of these thoughts that in our heads, then there is a possibility of finding transformation here and now. So stepping beyond suffering means allowing suffering to be a teacher from the past, but pushing us towards something greater, something more profound in the future. We do this, though, by living in the present, because every interaction we have with the universe happens in the present moment. It's the quality of the present moment, over which we have no control at all, that allows us to envisage transformation in the future.
Thank you so much. You say in the book that suffering is optional, but pain is not. Can you explain the distinction and why it's such a powerful shift in perception?
Pain, as described in the book, refers to physical sensation. So you drop something heavy on your foot, you're going to have pain. We've all been through childbirth. Everybody alive has experienced childbirth, which is probably a very painful experience, both for the mother, which is sort of obvious because she can talk about it, but also for the child, which is not obvious because we not only don't talk about it, we largely forget about it. So pain is simply a part of having a body. We need pain to let us know that something needs fixing. For example, a toothache says essentially, go to a dentist. That's pain. Suffering is when we internalize anxiety and fear, depression perhaps, and allow them to be the guiding principles by which we make decisions. That is optional.
Thank you so much. It's a great help, at least for me, understanding the distinction between them and our option, our choice. You also write that creativity, presence, and true flow from the me, while the ego thrives on fear and control. How can we start to live more from that creative place of us?
Life is flowing through our body as a free gift. We usually ignore it, but it doesn't mean that it goes away. And it stays with us for a number of years. With me, it's almost 75. With some people, it'll be less, with some people more. But the dynamism, the strength of life encourages us to engage with the universe. It encourages us to ask difficult questions. Why am I here? What is my purpose? How do I love? Am I supposed to be doing something with my life? And so on. Life will always to look beyond ourselves. The ego's natural instinct is to cause people to stop looking beyond themselves and look after their own interests. Yes, but what about my pension? What about my salary? What about my interest in whatever it is that's going on in the world? How does this war actually affect me? Most of those questions end in nothingness because there's nothing to answer. But life encourages us then to go beyond the small me and look at the bigger picture and to see that inflicting suffering on other people is no better and no worse than inflicting suffering on yourself. It's the same. We have identity with each other, and we need to refine that identity if we're going to allow the human species to go on for very much longer.
Thank you for this explanation. You also include beautiful exercises and practices in the book. Is there one that continues to guide or surprise you in your own life?
I think there are two. The first is the airport exercise. It used to be called Grand Central Station, but that was when I was living in the United States. The airport exercise involves going to a crowded place, finding somewhere to sit down, possibly like a cafe or something like that, make yourself comfortable, and simply to observe the people as they're wandering past. Not in a sort of ghoulish way. Be careful because you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, but gently notice people as they pass. Refrain from giving them a title, a label of any sort, because the ego is so used to putting us in a pecking order. Who am I in relation to this person? Is this person richer than I am, poorer than I am, better looking than I am, and so on and so on? The ego wants to give a label and then just dismiss them. Okay, you can go now. Now I'll look at somebody else. If we stop labeling people, we can come to a place, and it takes practice. It's not something that happens easily or automatically. We can come to a place where we simply accept whoever is in front of our gaze as they are. And I think in spiritual terms, what we're beginning to do there is to begin to see that person as God sees them. Now, this isn't to put any dogmatic weight on the word God. That's up to you, the reader. Reader can provide that for themselves. But if we can look at people without labeling, then we look at them with complete acceptance. And if we look at them with complete acceptance, then we are looking at them as the Creator looks at them. And I think this is a fundamental skill that everybody could benefit from learning. The other one, which I really like, the last one mentioned in the book, which is simply to sit in a space wherever you happen to be, in your room, outdoors, in a park, doesn't matter where, and to select two of what I would like to call the divine qualities: light, love, joy, peace, truth, and so on. Just to select two of those qualities and use one to breathe in and another to breathe out. This comes strangely from science, because I was never very good at science, or I had bad teachers, one of the two. And what I did learn at one point was that we tend to breathe in oxygen and we tend to breathe out more carbon dioxide. And how oxygen came to be around this planet is in itself a very beautiful story, but that's for another day. We need oxygen, but for many things, oxygen is in fact poisonous. So we're actually a very specialized organism that specializes in. But in our breathing, which is the foremost interface between the self and the universe, there is a change takes place. We take something in and we breathe something out. We actually transform, not chemically exactly, but we transform through the process the world around us. We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Most plants do exactly the reverse, but that's also a story for another day. The idea here is that even when we are sitting still, apparently doing nothing, we need to be aware that we are transforming the universe, even a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. So if you, for example, breathe in light and breathe out love, you are helping the universe in its own work of transformation. And I think that's basic to the well-being of every person living on this planet.
Oh, wow, that's so beautiful. You give a purpose to the breathing. I think that's an incredible element that for sure inspires me to breathe more presently. Thank you so much for sharing this. For someone listening who feels overwhelmed by suffering or by anxiety or by complexities of the modern world, what is the most compassionate first step they can take today? Can you share your perspective?
I believe that learning to detect and to ignore compulsive thinking brings results for almost everybody I've worked with, including myself. Once we've got the hang of the fact that I am not my compulsive thoughts, I am not my feelings, rather I am the observer of both. I'm simply observing what's going on in my life, then most people can lift themselves from depressive states into relatively good and fulfilling living states quite quickly. So overall, that would be my first answer. Whether you need to work with a therapist is another issue. That's possible. Whether you need to work with a recovery group, that's also possible. But this basic need to see ourselves as the observer of life rather than the cause of fear and destruction would be a very, very important first step to take.
Thank you so much. You also mentioned that our suffering is often ego trying to protect us, but badly. What helped you to shift from fighting ego to learning to ignore it?
The key word for me here would be acceptance. We've talked about acceptance in relation to the airport exercise. It's a very, very important concept in most spiritual traditions because what it does is to say, I accept my life exactly as it is right now, not in some time in the future, not in the past, but right now, I accept my life. If I do anything except accept, then what I'm really saying to God, the universe, whatever, is, I don't like your reality. I don't like what you've given me. What I want is the stuff in my head. I've got an image in my head. Okay, it's only a fantasy or an idea, but I have an image in my head of how things ought to be, and that's what I want. I'm sort of convinced that that brings pain to almost everyone who uses that particular. And you see it at work in politics, you see it at work in corporate life, you see it at work in institutional life of all sorts throughout the world, where people have an image of how things ought to be, but it's different from what is. The trouble here is that if you're fighting what is, you've already lost because what is already is. So if we take this stance, we lose it before we start it. So let's stop doing that. Let's first of all move to a place of acceptance. I accept who I am. I accept this about me. I accept my past. I accept my environment. I accept whatever my life brings me. I accept all those things. Perhaps the next question is what needs to be changed? That's another question. But the acceptance has to come first. And if you don't make that small adjustment, and sometimes it doesn't cost any effort at all, then everything else becomes much, much more difficult.
Thank you so much. What message would you offer someone who feels lost in their suffering or unsure if peace is possible for them?
I think the first thing to say would be that you're not alone. A lot of the worst suffering exists because we feel cut off from each other. We sometimes feel cut off from ourselves. We feel cut off from God. We feel whatever. This is simply not true at any level of existence. But the ego says that's the only true thing in the entire universe. If God exists at all, says the ego, he's way over there somewhere, and you're way over here. You probably won't have much contact with him at all. Don't even think about it. But the reality is that God is in the atoms of our bodies. God is flowing through our veins. God is the inspiration for all of our authentic thought, not the ego's thoughts. I can't blame God for that, but for our intuitive thoughts, our inspirational thoughts. So first, we're not cut off from each other, allowed ourselves to realize that we are not separate from everything else. Then the next layer is simply this: whatever suffering you have, as long as it has a purpose. If your suffering causes something good to happen, then go ahead and suffer. It's not that bad. It's part of what it means to be a human being. At some level, if you're an athlete and you want to win a race, you're going to train hard, and that's going to involve suffering. If you want to pass your exams, you're going to have to study hard. That's going to cause some sort of suffering, and so on. The worst suffering is the suffering that has no purpose. Pain for the sake of pain. Not pain as a signal, not pain as a help, but simply pain and suffering that we carry around and sometimes even guard as if it's our right to carry suffering around. It's very weird, but that's what a lot of people do until they realize they don't have to do that anymore.
Thank you so much for this beautiful message. How people can follow you, how people can find you, your work, what you're doing, how can you share?
Well, at the moment, things are still in the building up situation. There is a website, peter-weber.com, but there's not much there yet because it's in development. The first book, A Step Beyond Suffering, is out and is available on Amazon and almost every other place. If you follow the website from time to time, any news of updates will be shown there, and that's probably the best way to do. If anybody wants to contact me personally with any questions about any of this stuff, then there's the chance to write to me at info@peter-weber.com.
Thank you so much. It is great privilege and pleasure. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.